Hello, everyone. I haven't posted to this channel for a while, but I can't resist wading back into the fray on intellectual property. I watched Academic Agent's video with half attention, and I thought, this is some interesting stuff. So my plan for this stream is I'm going to rewatch it and give my thoughts off the top of my head. The basic positions here is that I think the world would be better if we simply abolished copyright law altogether. And AA is very strongly of the opposite opinion. He thinks copyright law is great. He thinks it's one of the best inventions ever, and it's single-handedly saving the universe. I think that was approximately his argument. I guess before we get started, I should point out I'm not Stephen or Stefan Kinsella. I haven't read his book. I am not fully aware of his arguments, so I don't want to be seen as his advocate in particular. I'm sure his arguments are very good and probably stronger than mine, but I do think they're different. And in general terms, I think my perspective is more along the lines that copyright law is leading to a bad outcome, whereas he's more along the moral lines that copyright law is wrong fundamentally, regardless of the outcome. And I suppose if I was going to sum up my basic feelings about this topic in one sentence, it would be that the skepticism I have for governmental intervention in all other areas of life extend into this area. And I think the burden of proof for me is on anybody to prove that the government and the state should be getting involved with something to make it better. I think generally, when you have big, powerful groups exerting influence over populations, and they want to keep that power going, you should enter with skepticism. Anyway, let's see what AA actually says. Hopefully
we had a bit of a debate about intellectual property rights, specifically copyright and trademarks, with several libertarian friends of mine on EconChat. I've linked it in the show notes. I was on the side of IP. Radlib, Lambda, and MadMerc were on the anti-IP side. I consider their position to be nonsensical and vice versa. They were drawing on the libertarian legal theorist Stephen Kinsella, who is a member of the Mises Institute and who wrote what is considered the definitive argument on this topic. It is called Against Intellectual Property.
Ben Gale says, still realign from your defeat by AA. Well, I don't know if I'd characterize it that way.
In this video, I want to do...
But I do think his strength of feeling is greater than mine. I think I've got zero chance of having any effect on the system. So in some ways, I don't really care about winning this argument. It wouldn't produce any difference in the world if I were to persuade people of my opinion here. So I see this as a sort of fun intellectual exercise. Whereas I think quite a lot of people on the other side of the argument are genuinely afraid for their livelihood and consider this a personal attack.
Two things. First, I want to lay out my own positive vision of intellectual property. That is, I want to explain why I support IP on both moral and utilitarian grounds. Second, I want to pinpoint where I think Kinsella goes wrong. So let me begin.
All right.
We are the music makers, and we are the dreamers of dreams. These lines begin the poem Ode by Arthur O'Shaughnessy. They are repeated.
You cannot question this video's rhetorical style, starting out with an attempt to grab the hearts and the minds of the viewers, far more important than winning an intellectual case.
By Willy Wonka, as played by Gene Wilder in the 1971 film. And it is, in fact, with Wonka that I'd like to start my defense of IP. In that same film, Wonka sings, "Come with me, and you'll be in a world of pure imagination. Take a look and you'll see into your imagination. But
Beloved Willy
access to
Wonka.
this world is closed off. Of course, famously, Wonka issues 5 golden tickets, and the lucky winner.
Now, do we want gatekeepers to our own imaginations? Is this what's being advocated for? That Willy Wonka had the right to prevent us from imagining things on our own?
Gain access to his dream world, a dream world which has been made manifest in.
Yeah, the more I think about it, there's a bit of a Disney theme here, isn't there? Copyright has basically been pushed primarily by lawyers working for Disney. And now we discover that this channel is not only a Mary Poppins fanboy, but is also drawing arguments out of. It was Disney who did Willy Wonka, this film, was it not? With Gene Wilder? Maybe I'm wrong.
In a physical factory, but which originated in the head of Mr. Willy Wonka. In the film, these tickets are so scarce and so highly prized that everybody from the Queen of England to South American dictators do whatever they can to get some Wonka bars in order to try to win a golden ticket. Why do I mention this? I mention it because intellectual property is much like gaining access to Wonka's factory. When you buy a book for...
I'm wrong. I think it was Warner. But I think it's on Disney Plus, so they have the rights now.
For example, you are not
in
buying
fact, I'd be interested to know what AA thought of the new modern adaptation of Willy Wonka.
You are buying, in effect, a dream ticket. You are buying access to the world of pure imagination dreamed up by the author. And just as the kids in Wonka, you get to play there for a while.
Now, I'd like to re-emphasize here, I'm not interested in trying to assess whether or not these concepts actually exist or if there's an objective moral basis for copyright one way or the other. I want to know, if we have these laws, is it going to make society better or worse? We're evaluating the effects. I think Tragedy of the Commons is a very good argument to explain why property rights are useful. It's not the only argument in favor of property rights, but there's a clear positive effect of having property rights to solve the problem of the tragedy of the commons, which is loads of people using the same resource results in the resource being mismanaged. Nobody has an interest in restraining themselves because that won't solve the problem. And I think there is an interesting argument later about whether or not the problem of the tragedy of the commons can be generalized into the playground of ideas. So we will see whether that argument holds up. But I'm kind of going to skip over some of the. I think Kinsella's probably making points that AA is rebutting, and I don't feel the need to defend.
The book is a physical portal into the dream world. It is obvious that when people buy, for example, a copy of George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, they are buying this experience, access to the fantasy world, rather than mere paper and ink. This is why.
Now, what they're literally doing is buying the paper and ink. I think the claim that they are really buying access to the world is a bit fanciful. It's not clear to me that that's what people are paying for. People make their transactions and economic business for the actual practical difference it will make in their life, rather than on the basis of some theoretic benefit that it's supposed to give them.
Why people will also buy it in audio form or in digital form.
Yeah, if they only had access to it as a dream ticket to the ideas, if you had a paper copy, you wouldn't also need to buy an audio copy. But if you have a paper copy but you want to listen to it while you're out on a run, you then need to buy. So the form that arrives in is significant.
The material form of the text is less important than the ideas that the text conveys. The text is just a portal.
And likewise, I've refused to buy audiobooks that are abridged, even though I wanted to hear the story. So in that case, the exact form, the every single word I wanted to be in place before I considered it valuable. But that's a personal decision. I don't know. These are thoughts off the top of my head. I'm not claiming to. Every comment is rebutting and refuting the argument here.
So intellectual property is justified on these grounds. You are buying access as manifest in a physical object to ideas and experiences, much like a ticket to a theme park. I suppose it's no coincidence that Walt Disney invented.
Now, let's think about this example of buying access to a theme park by buying a ticket. Now, if you were really interested in, for example, buying drugs, and you knew that the drugs were being dealt inside the theme park, you might buy the ticket to the theme park, not for the reason that the creator intended. The creator wanted you to experience this wonderful world of Disneyland, but you're there for a different purpose. So we can't impose on consumers. We can't assume that the demand is for what we think it is. I think people act pragmatically is basically my point.
Disneyland. His business was selling dreams. And Mickey Mouse, one of the most famous IP properties in the world, is estimated to generate about $5 billion a year. What is the moral basis for an author laying claim to owning their ideas? We can justify it in the same way that land ownership rights are justified through the Lockean home.
Yeah, and I don't know if I agree with the Lockean homesteading principles. I might make myself some enemies on my own side by saying this, but I'm not completely sold on homesteading
principle. If you consider that in the landscape of ideas...
I also don't think that the landscape of ideas is real. So I kind of, this argument misses me on both fronts.
Or if you prefer the world of pure imagination, or if you prefer Plato's world of forms, ideas are nearly infinite in their potential and variety. Now,
if the world of forms does exist, Plato's world of forms, I believe, states that the concepts exist. They have a reality, an existence, regardless of whether anyone thinks of them, regardless if anyone believes them, which is interesting because that makes invention more like discovery. So in that case, we're kind of claiming that coming up with the idea of Mickey Mouse was more like there was Mickey Mouse already existed and we just stumbled into him, which I actually think AA doesn't really believe. So I'm going to consider this really to be a distraction, this world of forms stuff.
Only seems fair that the person who gets to a specific configuration of said ideas to have homesteaded that configuration on the finders keepers principle. Walt Disney was the only person to invent Mickey Mouse, a character with unique and distinctive features. Let us not pretend that he is not unique and distinctive. We know he has the big ears, the white gloves, the red.
Yeah, this is a point I agree with, and I think it's important to point that out. Mickey Mouse is distinctive. There's no question you recognize Mickey Mouse. There were lots of decisions that went into creating the character. If there's a knockoff version of Mickey Mouse, it's not necessarily better or worse, but there is significance in whether you recognize the form as being Mickey Mouse. Now, we've seen changes to Mickey Mouse from Disney down the years. You can see the character morphing and changing, but Disney maintains the claim that it is the same character. So we get into quite strange, murky territory about is it the component parts of Mickey that make him Mickey Mouse? Similar to the question about if you replaced every part of a ship one at a time, at some point it becomes another ship. So if you had a character called Mickey Mouse, and after 10 years you changed the ears to be a different shape, and then after another 10 years you changed the head, you changed the arms, at any point there's a continuity about who Mickey Mouse is. But anybody in the culture would understand that you're referring to this character, who I will say has significance because of a great deal of money and investment by Disney, and Disney intends to make the best of it. That there isn't, I'm not saying that there isn't both value in owning IP, nor is it free to create. There's a lot of work involved. So I'm not saying removing IP is easy or free. But I think it's an interesting. Now, another question is, was the character of Mickey Mouse in any way an inevitable invention? Would we expect a mouse-like character to become part of public consciousness? I think AA and his supporters will immediately react against that idea and say, no, it wasn't inevitable. And I would agree to some extent that every single detail of Mickey Mouse was not essential. But you would potentially expect there to be a cartoon character who wins the battle to be the primary cartoon animal in public consciousness. And maybe it doesn't matter which one it is, but when you're, as a society, when you need to fill in children's imaginations, that kind of anthropomorphic, fun-loving, recognizable character, you just pick the go-to character. So in some ways, the fact that Mickey Mouse is successful might not be purely down to the specific design of Mickey Mouse, but more down to general societal dynamics that would have happened one way or the other. Mickey Mouse is effectively the brand cheerleader for Disney, i.e. very boring. And I suppose Mickey is almost so famous and recognizable that we can't perceive, we cannot imagine coming across Mickey as a new character. I actually think Mickey Mouse would be quite strong if you could genuinely lose your associations with Disney and the branding and the soulless corporations. I actually think it is a strong design. There's a reason that those, especially Disney himself, but other talented people, stuck with this mouse as their brand. But is the fact that it's I realize we've paused
shorts,
here at 5 minutes.
the yellow shoes, too long. His very specific face, and so on and so forth. Disney was the only person in the world to put together these specific elements in this specific form.
Sorry, having said we needed to make some progress, I've thought of something else I think is important to say. The fact that Mickey Mouse has this particular set of attributes is partly coincidence, but I think is partly as a result of an iterative process optimizing the character. So it's not a complete coincidence that is the size of his eyes, that this is the size of his hands, the fact that there's this collection of colors. All of these details have psychological reasons. And when you're designing a character, you are inevitably, there's a tension between trying to invent something and trying to stick to the combination of characters which fulfills a particular purpose. So will it serve another company just as well to create a character from scratch, but they must avoid all of the characteristics that might get compared with Mickey Mouse? Well, in a parallel universe, they may have come up with a character who is more similar to Mickey Mouse than you think. Let's carry on.
And therefore, it is correct that he owns the rights to this character, and subsequently that he is able to transfer or sell those rights to third parties, much as the original owner of some land may sell the deeds to a third party.
I don't know if this is supposed to be an argument. It seems like that is explaining the current situation. The way that we talk about it in current language is that there's this idea of rights. That you own the rights, and we understand what that means colloquially. The fact that we immediately understand these concepts isn't necessarily showing that it's intuitive or correct. I think we recognize the system under which we are brought up, and tend to think that it's right until proven otherwise. I don't think the connection between a concept such as Mickey Mouse and a physical object should be taken as a given. I think any of us could construct an argument pretty easily to explain how a physical resource has a concept of ownership different from an intellectual one. The obvious one being that two people can use an intellectual resource at once and be unaffected, unaware. Well, okay, no, I take that back. You're likely to be affected. If you're operating in the same region and you're trying to make money from the character, you will be affected. So perhaps I don't want to be so hasty. I'm sure I'll have more thoughts on that as we go through.
That is how property rights work. Those who argue against IP claim that copying an idea is not the same as stealing it, because if someone uses their own printing press to copy, say, a print of Mickey Mouse or a copy of
this is more or less what I was saying,
Song
right?
of Ice and Fire, then the claim to IP is violating the
and I think he's going to give
of
the same
that
rebuttal
printing
I just
press's
did as
property
well.
rights, because it is
Let's see.
dictating what they can do with it. In this case, the anti-IP advocates claim that the owner of the printing press should be allowed to do with their press as they please, and indeed to sell
seen
the
a lot of people
products
making this
of
argument. So to reiterate, this argument isn't the one that I was making explicitly. This is the more strong moral argument that is saying clearly the non-aggression principle is the foundation of everything we believe. If somebody has a printing press, they have the right to do with it whatever they like. And so to prevent them from using it is actually a violation of their property rights, which is, I think, maybe true, but not my argument, and not one that I think is worth me defending now. I think I'm prepared to concede this argument, just because it's not one that I was originally making, and I don't think I'm the best person to defend it.
Press, even if those products are not ones they came up with themselves. But this is willfully to misunderstand what is being sold. As I said, it's not paper and ink that is being sold.
Interesting from British Brian, not sure how relevant it is, but Disney did not design Mickey Mouse. It was UB iWorks. Obviously, he worked on a contract, hence why Disney holds the rights. And we eagerly anticipate the second half of your message. Interesting. And to some degree, I would agree with AA in the sense that we do recognize there being a difference in quality generally between the people who are involved in the original creation and setting up a fantastic universe, making great things, designing Mickey Mouse, whatever, and then people doing knockoffs, and the knockoffs can be extremely low quality. I do not think we need copyright to preserve the ability of both creators and audiences to find each other, and to maintain a level of control. This is probably the meat of the argument, I would say, between me and AA, is the kind of speculative problem of would it be the case, absent IP, that we would see as he puts it, a destruction? Like would we see all of these great properties which have such artistic integrity would become impossible to maintain? Okay, British Bereans got back. Given that the design work is the dream world of iWorks, this is potentially a kind of intellectual slavery. Yes, I like this idea, but again, not my argument, so I'm not going to die on that hill. But it's interesting, British Brian. I suppose AA maybe would say that it's not intellectual slavery, but it's employment. And when you're employed by somebody, you are paid money in exchange for your time and potentially your ideas. So if iWorks had signed a contract with Disney to say anything I create, I pass the property over to the company, it seems above board to me. So it's an interesting thought, though. Maybe there's something more there that if I thought harder would be a solid knockdown for AA. He says, I think like most things in our society, the laws, institutions, and traditions have become weaponized against us to the point that we might have to destroy it all. Well, I wonder if we don't even need to destroy it. It may all come crumbling down on its
But tickets
own account.
to a dream world. What right does some third party have to sell such tickets to dream worlds that they did not create? None at all. And
what right does a third party have? That is the question that we're discussing.
This is readily understood by all right-thinking people. In the absence of
Okay. There's no actual content in those sorts of comments, but I enjoy the passion. Carry on.
State, the original creator would have to take up arms or to employ security firms to enforce their IP claim. But this
would they, though? I think this is where the lack of imagination comes in for me. If I were living as a consumer in the world without IP, I would seek out claims of authenticity, and I don't think it would be difficult for them to be provided. I don't think that creators would be interested in preventing other people from making knockoffs of their work. In fact, from the games industry, as an interesting comparison, there's kind of two philosophies that companies take towards people modding their games. And it seems like the games which allow and encourage a modding community are way more profitable. And yet nobody is in any question about what is the original game. You know, playing vanilla Minecraft is a well understood concept. Now, of course, in the case of copyright, the question would be, what if somebody copied the entire game, every single detail of it, re-implemented it? Now, I guess as a quick rebuttal to that, I actually think being the first mover does give you some advantage in and of itself. Just being there first, you've already got the market. Imagine if I start a new YouTube channel, which is identical to an existing YouTube channel in every single detail. The audience for my copy of that YouTube channel, given no other advantages, would not be very big, because everybody's going to continue to use the first one that already has an audience and continue to discover the original one. I'm going to have a very hard time getting off the ground if I'm not providing anything additional. Yeah, Nathan, you are very welcome to re-upload this on your channel. Actually, I responded to that without realizing that this was a meta question. Would I be happy for you to re-upload this regardless? Because I don't actually consider this stream particularly significant. So I sort of answered that with a I don't care attitude. But suppose I had poured my life's work into creating this stream. I guess I think in a world without IP, it would be my lookout if I chose to upload something with no protections and no monetization strategy that was my life's work. This is where the artists will get upset first hearing me say this. But if there was an existing system, imagine that the government operated a kind of find the prime numbers that multiply to this giant prime number. And you spent your entire life hunting for the solution to this math problem. And the government promised, if you find the solution to this, we will pay out £1 million or £1 billion. and you'd spent 20 years searching and you were pretty sure you were going to find it pretty soon, and then the government shut down that system, you'd be annoyed. You'd say, don't I have the right to, I've devoted my life to this. How can I now find new employment? It's totally unfair. So I have sympathy for people who are currently operating under this system, worried that it's going to go away. So I just want to reassure them, don't worry, copyright isn't going anywhere. If the society had grown up without copyright, we would have much better ways for us each to monetize. I think a little bit of an imagination, but then I also think we'd be able to have roads without the government. So maybe I'm just off my rocker. Another quick comment, and then we'll carry on. Sometimes it doesn't matter much if you're the first mover, if the second mover has much bigger reach. Excellent response, John. Very, very good point, and I'm glad you brought that up. So yes, imagine instead of little Nathan Hood's channel, if my stream was being mirrored onto like PewDiePie's channel or something. If PewDiePie was like, well, in addition to my videos, I'm also going to be putting Lambda's videos up from now on. Would that be good or bad for me? I suspect in that particular instance, it might be good for me. I think there'd be people who'd be like, actually, I'm going off PewDiePie, but I quite like this Lambda chap. Maybe that's a very big-headed way of responding to that particular objection. But you're right. If say I was publishing, say I was J.K. Rowling and I was publishing Harry Potter, but I didn't own a publisher, or I'd made a deal with a small publisher, and then a big publisher comes along and just starts doing complete carbon copies. Yeah, that. Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen. Yeah, it's interesting. I agree. It would cause you to lose profit. I will concede that point. If I was making money from something purely under the assumption that it wouldn't be copied, I would then lose it. And I guess my answer to that is I actually think authors ought to work under the principle that they're paid in advance, and that they work on their reputation, and that they produce increasingly excellent works of fiction such that they obtain better and better patrons. And their patrons can then, I don't think it would be a bad thing that the patrons can then influence the work, cause the writer to write something that they are interested in, which already happens under the current system to some degree. If you want to make money as a writer, you have to write what people are going to buy. So this would be, I think, a better system. So, for example, I could upload videos on YouTube for free all day, and I just accept other people can take those videos pixel for pixel and repost them as their own, and I don't make any money. I have no protection over that. But I'd be building my reputation as an individual creator. And with that reputation, I could then go to the masses or whoever and say, look, I can make more videos for you, but I'm going to need money because I can't find the time. I need it, my job's got busy or whatever, but I can put aside the time if you pay me. That's the world I would prefer to live in. And I think it would be a richer, I think it would be a richer artistic environment, which would actually lead to artists having more money and more control over their creations.
This, again, is no different to a property claim on land, which is enforced on pain of violence. Again, in the free market, in the absence of a state, Walt Disney would have to employ security firms to defend his land. And in the same way, he would employ a security firm to defend his IP claim on Mickey Mouse. In our society, property rights are upheld by the state, and so IP rights are upheld by the state. But the principle is identical. To try to distinguish.
Now, how much of an ANCAP you are is determined by how much you think this is a good thing that the state is required for defending every last bit of your physical property rights. I think the attempt to say that there is no such thing as intellectual property, it's all property, I think is kind of ludicrous. I know that saying it's ludicrous is not an argument. So I'm sort of returning in kind to AA saying that we are mad earlier. There would be a very simple prepositional way to draw the distinction. Whether the distinction is a useful one or not, I think, is the question. But the fact that IP is currently defined in law is kind of sufficient evidence, I would say, that you can make that distinction. And I think it would be a useful distinction to make if for no other reason than that I think IP should just be free for anybody to use.
Between land and IP on the basis that one is physical and the other is only in the realm of ideas,
mine is a pragmatic,
seems to me to be literalist in the most dunderheaded sense. In fact, that it is chiefly an idea, which is to say a non-material thing, that is at stake in questions of subjective value, is intrinsic to economic theory, going right back to Carl Menger.
So the value of anything is subjective. That's what Menger, that was his kind of big contribution, I believe, to economics. And he's obviously correct. I can't deny that intellectual property has value in that we can describe it and define it in a way that it has existence in people's minds and that they're prepared to exchange money for it. Actually, the way that it's really obvious is when you're dealing between businesses and they will buy IP from one another. In that case, you're literally buying the IP rights. You're not even paying for a physical medium that happens to contain the intellectual property within it. You're just buying the right to use the intellectual property, and it is valuable. So I, as I say, I'm not disputing whether or not these things are able to be defined or could exist as concepts. They clearly do exist as concepts. I don't think they have a objective reality in the world of forms. And I don't think they're a good thing for society. Carry on here.
Recall,
we're only 10 minutes away. I don't think we'll do the whole video.
No one values wheat as wheat per se, but for the individual functions that wheat satisfies. So really, the person doesn't want the wheat, but the idea of something to satisfy his food need, something to satisfy his hygiene need, something to satisfy his need to feed his cows, something to satisfy his need to make alcoholic drinks, and so on and so forth. Thus, wheat can be substituted with any number of other goods that fulfill the same function for a minimal trade-off of want satisfaction. The actual physical good.
I suppose if I was to reply on his terms, he's wanting to make the claim that there isn't any sensible way to make the distinction. I guess if I wanted to make a clear conceptual concept that would at least seem as self-consistent as he's making this out, I'd more go down the line of what is the definition of violating property rights. I think you could come up with a definition of a violation of a property right, which would only affect the things in any way that matter, the physical objects. So you wouldn't even have to define what is a physical object versus what is non-physical. You could say, well, that's all right. You can claim anything to be property, but violating property rights requires, and then whatever, I don't have that. I haven't thought it through sufficiently, but you could define the violation of a property right as being to prevent somebody else from using that item for their ends. So in some ways, that opens up the possibilities for people to share physical objects in a way which I'm quite interested in. Is that a useful, like if I walk across a farmer's field and the farmer isn't aware, should the farmer be capable of claiming that I've trespassed? Now, in reality, if you walk across the field, you're going to damage the crop. You're potentially going to lead to him having additional safety concerns that he doesn't want to worry about. So that specific example doesn't work. But I just wonder whether trying to define whether intellectual property should be allowed is the wrong discussion, and we should be talking about what's the meaning of a violation of property rights.
Is subordinate in each case to the psychic need being addressed, the satisfaction that is satisfied. This is the thing that is valued, not the object itself. The actual physical good is subordinate in each case to the psychic need. In a sense, then, all goods satisfy wants that cannot be seen or easily measured. Yet we take it for granted that there exists a market for wheat and that a man can own wheat as property. What difference then between wheat and the virtual good, which in our case are the tickets to a dream world?
Let me give you an example of how violation of property right could be overdefined. I don't think looking at somebody else's property is a violation of their property. So imagine a society in which that were the case, where merely to glance across the street and accidentally lay your eyes to rest upon somebody else's car was a punishable crime. I think we would agree that in that case, violation of property right had been overdefined. And I think that's what's happening here. We're claiming that in the case where you can, maybe here's another example. So if you were an artist and you drew a picture that contained somebody else's property and then made money from the drawing, is that a violation of their property rights? Because it was the shape and form and location and color and texture of that particular object that somebody else owned that ended up on your canvas and then produced you money. Is that a violation of property rights? Perhaps some people would say yes. I think most people would say no. In a similar way, if an idea is used, you hear the idea and you use the idea to make money yourself. You didn't come up with the idea. Perhaps the idea took a great deal of work and effort to generate in the first place, but is merely reusing somebody else's ideas a violation of that property right? If not, it doesn't matter whether intellectual property exists or not. There's no way of violating it.
Created by some author. Just as the physical wheat is only a physical token of that mental need that the consumer wishes to satisfy, so too is the book only a physical token representing that mental need of accessing the dream world through which the words might transport you. This is to say nothing of other intangible goods on the market like swaps, futures, complex financial.
Yeah, and I think he's right. There probably are people who are objecting to intellectual property on weak grounds, such as you can't own a non-tangible object. Actually, property is quite complicated. I think you can draw up the idea of owning, for example, a band of the radio spectrum between a certain time of day, at a certain particular volume. That maybe something like that could even be owned. And yeah, swaps and futures, like if it's contract law, isn't it? A lot of non-tangible stuff comes down to we need the ability to enforce arbitrary contracts. Question, is seeing the drawing a violation of the artist's proposal rights, but then typo, property rights? Well, the drawing, so if somebody were to be selling forgeries, that would be seen as a violation of the property rights. So if you were to take a photo of the Mona Lisa and then make a really good facsimile and start selling it as if it were the Mona Lisa, then that's probably wrong on fraud grounds, and I don't really want to get into fraud. So suppose you're not claiming it to be the original Mona Lisa. Prints, maybe prints are a good example. I think Dee has brought up prints in the past. So a print, by definition, is something that you can reproduce many times as the original printmaker. Should it be that somebody else is prevented from doing an exact copy of your print, which would be indistinguishable and totally would diminish the market and the value of your first run prints that you had created? even if you're not claiming them to be originals, that there is a supply and demand question. But yeah, seeing something in your mind's eye also competes. If you can remember what a picture looks like, maybe you don't need a copy of it. So it's an interesting question. All of these questions I would way prefer to be phrased as, should such and such be a violation of the artist's property rights? And how do we decide this? I think we need to hold back state control as much as possible and only extend it, not that we have control, but if we were unassailable monarchs, we would only extend state control when proven beyond a reasonable doubt to be beneficial to society. So I'm waiting for that clear, unassailable evidence that property rights in intellectual space are an unassailable good.
Actual goods. All of these are accepted by libertarians, even though they don't really have anything kind of physical or tangible attached to them. But yet we recognize that they exist as assets. So I don't see this hang up on the word physical being valid at all, really. And this brings me finally to the utilitarian grounds for supporting intellectual property.
Yes, this
Why
is my
are property rights good at all, aside from the moral question of Lockean homesteading? They are good because they ensure that land is subjected to a self-interested monitor.
This is, to me, by far the most interesting argument in the video, because it's the only one I really care about. This is the argument that's directly addressing the question that I've been posing. Why is it good in general? Why is the outcome of preventing people from infringing on intellectual property rights, why is that going to lead to good outcomes for anybody? And I would say it's bad for the creator, but more importantly, it's really bad for everybody else. And I think AA lays his argument out quite clearly. So let's let him do that.
Someone who owns their own home is more likely to look after it than somebody who only rents.
Not correct.
And even more so than somebody who is simply given that home by the government. When land is held in common, it is said to lead to the tragedy of the commons. The monopoly ownership of intellectual property by the original author or whoever they sell those deeds to function in the same way. You have a self-interested monitor looking over how the IP is treated. Walt Disney would never allow Mickey Mouse to appear in ways that were fundamentally untrue to his creation, whereas if Mickey Mouse was subject to common ownership, in which any old Tom, Dick and Harry could make Mickey Mouse cartoons and products, we'd see poor Mickey abused and debased. Another context in which the tragedy of the commons is used.
Should we pause and just reflect on this argument in general? I totally see where this is coming from. And I like to think this is really, I think this is where AA gets the most passionate. I'd like to think this is where the meat of the disagreement is. Because I think he also disagrees with Kinsella. And I don't know whether or not Kinsella's arguments, they aren't as interesting to me as I've read them. Not that I have read them. As far as I've heard secondhand, his arguments are not as obvious to me, but could well be totally correct. So I'd say go and look into those. But this is the bit that I've thought about more. The argument is, imagine the world without copyright, instead of the incredible art that we do have, we would only have fan fiction, is basically what it comes down to, right? No longer would anybody be incentivized to create great works of art, and no longer would anybody be able to maintain control of the distribution of their work. And therefore, as a consumer, all you would receive is random rubbish off the internet. I almost don't feel the need to paint alternatives, because it seems so obvious to me that there would be systems erected to replace this. But clearly AA has a very strong view that they wouldn't, that this is how the world is. So I don't know. Let me pause and answer this comment. Should not the property right be tied to the nature of the form and function of the property, and therefore the infringement is tied to those factors. Some are just more difficult to enforce than others. Is the nature and the form and function of the property, are we protecting every function of the property, or only the functions to which the property has already been put? And likewise, we saw that the same basic ideas of, say, Game of Thrones can exist in multiple forms. They could be a book, it could be a TV show, it could be a game. I think tying intellectual property, limiting it, would be difficult, because an idea can span almost anywhere. You could come up with an idea like Mickey Mouse, and claim that your idea has relevance to almost everything. Clearly, some property you would be able to tie down, but I just fear that this is the exact problem, that intellectual property has this potentially enormous scope and causes these gigantic problems.
Usually evoked by libertarians is in environmental matters. It is said that a private forest owner seldom has the problem of overforestation because he has a vested interest in maintaining the value and productivity of his forest.
Let's see.
When woodlands and jungles are held in common ownership, however, they are subject to overforestation, which is to say too many people are chopping down trees in the absence of a monopoly right over those trees. This is also true of IP. We do not need to create hypothetical scenarios in which hundreds of people are creating second-rate Star Wars films or Mickey Mouse cartoons or Batman comics or anything else, because there are living examples of the tragedy of the commons due to lapsed copyright or public domain all over Amazon. Let me use an example of one of my most...
Okay, but before the example, I guess these are the two ways to approach a speculative question, like what would society be like with some significant change having happened. One is to try to search for similar examples, or even the same thing happening, but in different places or times in history. And the other is to rationalize and to try to do mental modeling or suggest likely ways that things will work. As I say, I consider, from my point of view, the burden of proof strongly to be on the other side here. In fact, that's almost entirely why I come down against copyright, because I don't really know what the world would be like without copyright. It's been around with us into, for the recent memory, the last few generations, when our entire society was formed. Radlib actually was pushing back and saying, we do know what the world was like without copyright because it didn't used to exist, which is true. It's even stronger, I would say, on our side. The evidence suggests the world worked perfectly well without copyright, but then copying was more difficult. That's the difficulty. We now have these technologies that make copying easy. Does that call for the existence of copyright? Interestingly, none of the arguments in favor point out that the development of copying machines of various sorts and the developments of technology are the problem that these are trying to address. There's not a clear link made, but I think we can read between the lines. What we're about to see is an example of how modern technology has potentially created a problem. But I as I say, I'm not convinced. Let's look into this particular example.
Beloved authors, Thomas Carlyle. Carlyle died in 1866, and his books are long out of copyright. Even with the 70-year rule, Carlyle's books would have been public domain by 1936 at the latest. The last official edition of his works was the Chapman and Hall Centennial Edition, originally published in 1895 to mark 100 years since Carlyle's death, and the final
Given that these rights that AA is arguing for are apparently for the benefit of the receiver of the artistic work rather than the artist, you would not expect any eventual timeout. of these property rights. I think the only way AA can be consistent is to assume that all intellectual property is owned throughout all time. There would be no such thing as a lapsing of copyright. Disney would continue to own Mickey Mouse for as long as Disney exists as a company, and when it folds, the intellectual property would be sold off and continue to be owned. And if you project this back in time, you'd find that every idea that humanity's has ever created would also be owned. We'd be paying the estate of, I don't know, every religion would own their own ideas, and potentially, Judaism came up with the idea of one God. So then, sorry, Christianity and Islam, but you don't have the right to start a religion with that particular concept in it.
Reprint was in 1907. Even today, this 30-volume complete works of Carlyle, edited by Henry Duff Trial.
We didn't have cars either, and no traffic laws. I think you're saying that the fact that we didn't have copyright before copying was really a thing isn't a good reason. It's not a strong argument to say that we shouldn't have copyright today. And I would agree with you. Right? We've created copying machines. Possibly we need to add copyright to the world. And I'm considering that. And my feeling on the basis of the evidence is that the addition of copyright is going to cause more harm than good, or has caused more harm than good.
Is the definitive edition, and it is printed by Cambridge University Press. Other scholarly presses also produce high-quality editions of his individual works. For example, Yale brought out this excellent edition of On Heroes and Hero Worship. However, because there is no self-interested monitor watching over the Carlyle estate, unless you are a trained scholar like me, you'd not know that these editions exist at all. If you search Amazon.
Interesting comment. Game of Thrones is an excellent IP to bring up. Martin owns the IP and licenses it out for games, shows, retains it fully for additional stories, but artwork and original music based on Martin's IP exists that he has no control or ownership of. It seems that there are limits set by what current right holders can think of claiming. Yeah, and as I say, you can make this all work. It's possible. You can define it all. And the question to me is like, is it good that this is the way the world is? I mean, clearly the music written based on Game of Thrones will have had some influence from the show. I don't think the composer was uninfluenced by Martin's creation. So if the rights holders for the music made that open source, then a little bit of Martin's IP has leached into the commons.
For books by Thomas Carlyle, you are confronted by the IP equivalent of The Tragedy of the Commons. What you'll find is pages upon pages of low-quality reprints by 2-bit pikey presses with random front covers, no scholarly notes, no indexes, no editors. These parasitic presses are not so much helping to keep Carlyle's memory alive as they are doing
Imagine somebody who left a totalitarian state in which all the food was provided for you and visited a supermarket in the West and was horrified to discover that instead of the lion stamp of approval on every tin of baked beans, there were baked bean cans which were, disgusting cartoon characters drawn on. There was baked bean cans that were the size of buckets. There was all sorts of variety of awful packaging that just didn't live up to the quality that this person was used to back in the totalitarian state. So as ever, the argument for monopoly is a difficult one to swallow.
Intellectual violence to him by offering the equivalent of discount scalper tickets to jump over the fence to gain access to Carlyle.
scalping is also something that I'm intellectually in favor of.
Carlyle's dream world. The fundamental problem is one of oversupply. There are simply too many presses bringing out low-quality editions of Carlyle, and there is no self-interested monitor to enforce quality control. Contrast that with an author who is in...
Now, there are very, very good quality, wonderful editions of works that are out of copyright. You can buy beautifully printed and bound, covered with editor's notes or whatever it is that AA is interested in. These things exist for works that are out of copyright. So I kind of think this argument doesn't even need further comment. Like, if you want a decent copy of a book, you can get one. I think his wider point is the IP, it's the ideas themselves, rather than the material form they exist in, are much more difficult to deliver to your core audience. Is it like, say, somebody else were to create a better sequel than George Lucas to the original Star Wars films, and then everybody followed that second creator for the third film? It's a plausible outcome. I'm just not convinced that that's bad for the world. If George Lucas really failed to make a good follow-up to Star Wars, then the audience would be right to turn their backs on him, I think. The idea that people would just swan to a random fanfic and not have any interest in the quality thereof is ludicrous. Carry on.
Copyright, such as George R.R. Martin, and you quickly find that no such problems exist, since he has granted Harper Voyager monopoly rights to print his work. There is no question as to which are the definitive editions, since you are not confronted with endless pages of second-rate versions. This is the world of IP, while this, the tragedy of commons you see on Carlyle's page, is the world that the anti-IPers want.
All I would have to do to counter-argue would be to produce any high-quality reproduction of an out-of-copyright work, which is almost anything that's treasured from more than 100 years ago. Let's skip through this ad, although do buy Foundations of Economics or whatever's being sold here.
So let us turn now to Stephen Kinsella's Against Intellectual Property and see how he justifies wanting this awful state of affairs. He suggests that the principle of scarcity is at the root of the need for property rights, and pulls on this quotation from Hans Hermann.
If the rest of this video is a response to Kinsella, maybe it's not the best use of our time to follow it through, because I'm not making Kinsella's argument. So I'm going to just jump to the last 5 minutes.
To you. Except for this one last point. A long-time buddy of mine, Jay Greenriver, has asked me about the case of second-hand books. He says, if it is the ideas being sold and not the pen and ink, how can I justify the sale of second-hand books being legal?
Interesting objection. Oh, I've got some comments. Let's see. Nathan, low quality goods can be cheaper up to consumer. Yeah, it's up to the consumer what quality they want. AA just wants the expensive Yale books. Yeah, I think there is a level of pure snobbery. You can imagine an out-of-touch academic would come up with such low-quality arguments. Yeah, do comment, everyone. So I think I've more or less finished watching this video, so I'll probably just answer people's chats and leave at this point. The argument that without the low-quality edition, high-quality editions would be more popular or more available sounds to me like saying that if we banned bread, all people would eat cake. Yes. Is this not a erroneously attributed saying? Oh, if the people have no bread, then what's the problem? They could just go and eat cake. Without the low quality editions, high quality editions would be more popular or available. Yeah, there's many other reasons why there might be high quality editions of Ice, Wind and Fire available than a book on than a reprint of Carlyle. I think the people who buy Carlyle are fundamentally a different audience to the people who buy Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is this extremely well-marketed, high production value book that's providing entertainment to people who are interested in dragons and adventures, whereas Carlyle is much more purely providing his thinking. And so, of course, the publisher has no interest in putting together very high quality. I mean, the official version that AA put up on the screen wasn't exactly screaming quality to me. I wouldn't want to shell out £30 for the copy of the book that he put up rather than buying a cheap paperback by a second. So to me, his point was almost self-defeating in that I thought the situation with Carlyle was appropriate. What if the owner had exclusive right to sell their works as canon, but not the ability to block other works? This seems like a compromise. I think that's a fantastic suggestion. Yes, I might even get 100% behind you there, Derevant. Although I wouldn't call that a compromise, I'd call that a win for me. If everyone agreed, but if we can all hold hands at the end of the day and skip off into the communist sunset with no IP. Oh no, hang on, that's the other side that are claiming that's my argument. Yeah, I think it's actually not necessary though, Derevant. Do we need the government to enforce canon? Or is it sufficient that you can provide a seal of quality, like the Nintendo seal of quality? And I think these days there are cryptographic methods to show your authenticity as an originator of a work. So I would say we're in a much better position than ever before in history to prove canonicity of contemporary authors. Scalping tickets is legal in Arizona. It has not yet created any great negative effects. Surprise, surprise. It has allowed the small positive of consumers being able to resell tickets that are no longer viable to them. Yeah, I think the people who are reacting against scalping are just economically illiterate. And I'm a bit surprised to see AA using that term purely for its emotive content. But I'd be amazed if we asked him about it, if he actually thinks scalping is as bad as people think. This might be the last comment. Is enforcing IP law not the same as prosecuting thought crime? Well, if thinking an idea that is somebody else's intellectual property is a violation of their property rights, then yes. But they're not choosing to define a violation of property rights in that way. So potentially so. However, they've chosen to limit the types of violation that they're prepared to consider. I just think we should limit it to not include replication. I think if you see somebody else, suppose I sculpt something and put it out on my front lawn and my neighbor sees it and creates the sculpture by hand themselves, they should be able to put that identical sculpture in their front lawn. That's always the way that it was throughout the ancient world, and it was fine, and nobody thought any differently of it. And children will not only be able to copy each other without moral qualms, but their parents wouldn't see anything wrong with, oh, you've done a copy of your friend's drawing. That's fantastic. You've done a really good job. So the fact that it's now possible to do mass manufacture and therefore make quite a lot of money by doing copying has led people to think, well, I ought to get some of that money. It's the same way that people feel if I had a really good idea. Like you hear people say this all the time. That app that's taken off, I had the idea for that app. Maybe I can even prove it. Like maybe I have a text where I suggested it to my mate. So I'm going to contact the people who actually put the hard work in to create the app, and I'm going to ask for a percentage of the profits. Why on earth do you deserve a percentage of the profits for having the same idea? The execution and the owning the materials are the valuable things. AA would probably love people scalping his Foundations of series, but not republishing them. Well, indeed. so that's interesting. I do think the fact that AA is making a significant amount of his money on the basis of IP means he's never going to be able to climb down from this hill. Because if he admitted that copyright is bad, he'd have to find a way to put his current series of courses in the public domain, and then he would stop making lots of money. So the fact that AA is able to use the current set of laws to make a bunch of money is meaning that he thinks those laws are correct, I suspect. No, I shouldn't just claim intellectual dishonesty on my interlocutors, should I? I think AA is probably being genuine, but we've had enough accusations thrown our way in the form of personal attacks. You're not an artist, so you wouldn't understand. I think there's just as much reason to think artists are misled in the reverse direction. Okay, well, I think I'll probably leave it there. Do leave comments under the video if you're still watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And especially if you think that you've got a counter argument to something that I've said. I'm very keen to have pushback. Thanks for joining me, everybody. Goodbye.